Have you ever had a piece of photo equipment that you later regretted buying? At one time or another, we've all done it. Maybe it was a product that you'd wished for a long time that just didn't live up to your expectations. Or maybe it was a last minute decision that came back to haunt you. I've been lucky enough to be pretty satisfied with most of the products that I've bought through the years. But every once in a while, I do get a lemon. One of the first things I wanted when I started getting into photography was some sort of telephoto lens for doing wildlife. I read a lot of books and magazines and paid attention to what focal lengths I needed to enable me to get to the close wildlife portraits I was looking for. Something in the 500 to 600 millimeter range was needed. However, I had been told that there were these lenses called catadioptic lenses, also called reflex or mirror lenses, that basically used the same principle that compact telescopes use of bouncing the light back and forth between mirrors to achieve the final image. They were compact, lightweight, and best of all, cheaper than conventional telephoto lenses. I should mention that when I first started out, there was not yet a thing called the internet. The only way to research things like this was to read technical trade magazines or books, or hearsay from other photographers. Also, shopping for such an item was a lot harder. Most photographers that bought telephoto lenses usually kept them. There wasn't a lot of equipment turnover back then, so finding used items in good shape was tough. That's why I was so excited when I found that a local camera store indeed did have a 500mm on hand. I rushed down to take a look. It was a Rokinar 500mm reflex lens, not to be confused with the Rokinon lenses. I bought it for $190, and boy did I think I had just made the deal of the century. This guy must not have known what he had. I just walked out of that store with a 500mm lens and only paid $190. And not only was it a 500mm, it was one of those really cool, newfangled reflex lenses that I had heard so much about. I even remember feeling a little bit guilty about it, thinking that maybe I should go back and offer to pay more. Well, the euphoria didn't last for very long. I was soon about to get my first lesson in "you get what you pay for," followed up by a double helping of "don't cut corners when it comes to photo equipment." The images, for all practical purposes, were pretty much unusable. They were so soft and unsharp, a symptom of buying an off-brand not even known to anyone. Mirror lenses, I would also soon learn, have a horrible bokeh by rendering all out-of-focus backgrounds as donut-shaped rings. Not to mention the fact that they are also a fixed open aperture of f8 and totally manual focus. I couldn't understand why my images were looking so bad. They didn't look anything like what I was seeing from top photographers. I soon realized that if I wanted the kind of sharpness I was looking for, I would have to fork out a bit more money and invest in a real, conventional telephoto lens that does the job right. When I finally purchased my Pentax 300mm, I finally saw the difference between the mirror lens and the real lens. Now, I think it should be noted that this purchase was not an entire loss. I have found it to be useful in trying to use its poor image quality to my advantage for stylized images requiring a softer, more amateur look. In fact, I've been wanting to put it on my Pentax digital body and experiment with getting some images with it now that I've accepted its shortcomings as a somewhat artistic asset. Even though I already had a decent tripod, I felt like I needed a small, lightweight tripod for my point-and-shoot camera. My plan was to get something small enough that I could store it under the seat of my vehicle and always be ready with a tripod when I needed it. I found this tripod at a local store and bought it. One thing I overlooked was the fact that a lot of the critical parts of the tripod was made out of plastic. I was going primarily off the Manfrotto name and figured that it would be a good product. All went well for a few months, but one time when I pulled it out to use it, I discovered that several of the leg locks would not lock. This is because they were made of plastic, and with the fluctuating temperatures in the vehicle, cold in the winter and heat in the summer, the plastic lever locks simply cracked. They were totally worthless. The only way to use the tripod was with all the legs compressed at its lowest level. That's when I learned another valuable lesson. Beware of plastic parts. It's not the plastic that's bad. It's fine if it's used for trim, but not when used for the vital, functional parts that get lots of use. This one will probably surprise a few people. And to be clear, I'm not saying that GoPros are bad. It's just that the early version that I bought left a lot to be desired. My main problem was that I had so many big plans for this little adventure camera. I was thinking of all sorts of uses for it. However, a short time into it, I was already having troubles. First of all, I found it very irritating that the version I had didn't yet have a rear LCD screen for reviewing the images or videos. To really have a look at what I took, I would have to download the content onto the computer first. Luckily, they have since corrected this design flaw. But my main problems were with the battery. It just didn't want to hold a charge for very long. I was always having to recharge it, which wasn't always possible. Another issue was that it couldn't maintain the Wi-Fi signal with either the phone app or the wireless remote. It was constantly dropping the signal, and a lot of times I would have to totally restart the camera to reestablish it. Then other times it would completely freeze up and I'd have to remove the battery and reinsert it to get it working again. Lots of times this would only last a short time until the problem started all over again. The last straw was when I decided to try a time-lapse. I set up the shot and started the camera with a fresh battery. When I came back later, the battery was dead and the card was completely fried. I couldn't even use the card ever again. That was the last time I ever used that camera. Again, I'm not saying that GoPros aren't better now. This is just my experience at the time, and frankly, unless the small size is what's needed, I'd rather go with a slightly larger camera that might have a better battery life. This one is definitely the result of me being in too big of a hurry. I was going to be leaving on a short notice trip to the Washington coast, and I knew I would be doing some seaside photography. I usually don't use UV filters, but when using lenses in this environment, it's a good idea to have some sort of protective filter on the front element of the lens to protect from the corrosive salt spray and blowing sand. I had only recently bought into the Canon system, and I didn't yet have a protective filter in that size. I was going to be leaving in a couple of days, and I didn't have much time, so I went out to the nearest electronics box store where I knew that they had a small selection of filters. I had never heard of the Rocketfish brand before, but I figured that since it was just a clear filter, there was no possible way anyone would mess that up. I was in a bind, so I reluctantly paid the $40 and went on my trip. When using the filter, everything seemed okay, but it wasn't until I got back home and started processing the images that I noticed something horribly wrong. All of the images shot with that filter were very soft. It just wasn't sharp at all. I was able to get the images to an acceptable point by using the sharpening tools in Lightroom, but it never looked as good as I knew it could have been with the better filter or no filter at all. My lesson learned with this one was to never buy a brand that doesn't have some sort of good reputation. If you do experiment with a new brand, start out small, read reviews, and always give yourself enough time to return it for a better one if need be. This last example came fairly recently. Many years ago, I had a book about medium format cameras. One of the recommended cameras in the book was the simple yet high quality Yashica Mat TLR. Many years later, I was lucky enough to find a used one in good condition. It's a great little twin lens reflex camera with a pair of fixed 80mm lenses. 80mm in the 2 1/4 film format is about the same as a standard 50mm lens in the 35mm film format. The lens is very sharp and I get great results from it. But back to the book. In the section about the Yashica Mat, it told of some auxiliary lenses that were available. Unlike interchangeable lenses, which actually change the entire lens, auxiliary lenses bayonet into the front of the existing 80mm lenses, effectively turning them into wide-angle and telephoto. Although the effect isn't that strong, it provides some added versatility to the camera's standard lens. I was excited when I recently came across some of these lenses and immediately purchased them. Not once had I ever questioned the resulting quality of adding another lens element to the front of the existing lens. I just assumed that since they were also made by Yashica, it would be sharp. When I got them, I could immediately see that there was a loss of sharpness and some vignetting with the wide angle. The effect is less on the wide angle, and you can sharpen it up by stopping the lens down, but not too far down, otherwise making the vignetting worse. The telephoto lens is a different story. It's noticeably soft, and there's not a lot that can be done about it. If you want a sharp image, you're probably better off shooting with the 80mm lens and simply cropping in on the frame to get the same telephoto effect. Whereas I am disappointed, I'm trying to see the bright side in it, and I'm thinking I will be using them in the same capacity as the mirror lens, and use the softness to my advantage for doing more artistic abstracts. So that's my main regrettable equipment purchases. It's one of the reasons that now, before I buy, I try to really research whatever it is that I'm considering, and I think about its long-term potential uses. I'd like to hear about some of your less than satisfactory experiences. Feel free to leave some comments below and tell me what you've learned from your mistakes. So until next time, I'll see you on the trail. For a long time, had some expectations for. Can anybody see me through all this fog and breath going? Cock-a-doodle-doo! Oh, shut up.
Quack, 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 quack.
Are you ever going to stop? Thank you. What's some of your less than satisfactory purchases? That guy is really driving me nuts. No, 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 no. Little shit. Get!